Good morning, everyone. My name is Annie Fink, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator for Wonderware, California. Thank you for attending our Learn in 30 webinar today, focused on system platform domain security. After the webinar this morning, we will be doing a short Q&A. Please type any questions or comments into the Q&A box, the chat box, or you can email us at webinar@california.wonderware.com. Now I'd like to introduce your presenter for today's webinar, Tim Brost. Tim is an automation industry expert and has been a Wonderware California product specialist for 2 years now. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Annie. Thanks for that introduction. And welcome everyone to this Learn in 30 webinar on system platform security. We'll be covering over domain security as well as the actual application security and how it works and functions and things to consider as well. Go ahead there. So with how industrial systems are growing, becoming more integrated with IT systems, having a robust and manageable security system from a domain level as well as from a SCADA level are becoming more and more imperative. Having them, policies being managed properly, as well as, use just role permissions, who can do what, and ensuring, no one can do things that they don't have the correct privileges to. So some stats in terms of OT security breaches. Most companies experience an incident, every two to four incidents over the course of a year, and it's seen as a growing need to make sure to ensure that the system is secure and eliminate that worry, or at least reduce that worry of an outside threat attacking, as well as ensuring there's no internal errors that or miss rights or permissions that weren't supposed to be done internally. The classic example of that I think was a few years ago when the state of Hawaii received or sent out a notification to all of its residents that an incoming missile was going to be hitting their location in 10 minutes, and it was just the result of somebody actually hitting a button by accident and not having either the proper role permissions to do so, or maybe like something like a verified right, or some sort of backup security measure to ensure that okay, hey, this message shouldn't necessarily go out. But with any security breach, whether it's internal or external, has some sort of cost to the company. Obviously that cost depends on the type of intrusion that was done, as well as the size of the company. So AVEVA's goals when it comes to security. First and foremost, it starts at the development level. So AVEVA takes it very seriously. All of their R&D engineers are continually trained with best practices in mind of how to properly implement security when it comes to an ICS software. And they incorporate that security knowledge into their agile development of the software. So it's going hand in hand with the new features that are being implemented to make sure that the highest level of security standards are being also considered. AVEVA System Platform was one of the first, if not the first, ISA Secure certification for ICS software. That was in 2016, I believe. And continually to keep that certification up, as well as a host of other different security certifications when it comes to things like cloud, as well as on-premise certifications. And really the goal for AVEVA is to by training development, by training all the users that are involved in the creation of the product, to increase their awareness of security and the things to keep in mind. And so ultimately, those requirements are defined within the software, as well as built into the architecture. So system platform installs security by default. I know it might not seem like it, but every time you start a fresh install of System Platform, default user is logged in, and default user is a user that's created by every install, and it's going forward, that should be your benchmark of the least privileges, or the lowest common denominator of privileges that you want for all users to have. So on that default user, you would define, all the roles that you don't care who is logged in and has access to. Um, but security is a part of System Platform automatically, even though when you see it, it'll say none. It's just every user is logged in as the default user. There is integration with your Active Directory, so you can closely monitor and implement, if you don't already have them, your policies, or work with your existing policies and ensure that System Platform is able to run in a functional manner. In terms of inter-node security, System Platform has the ability to configure transport layer security 1.2 between all nodes. I know transport layer 1.3 is out. It's not very common in terms of commercial use these days, at least from my knowledge. But once that becomes more commonplace, that'll be implemented into System Platform. And also the other benefit of System Platform is that it's been compatible with next generation endpoint protection systems. So some of those products are the vendors are Cylance, Protect, and Versec. And so they do kind of a next generational take on how security should be managed and handled, and do it very elegantly. So in terms of system management, so ultimately user management is, comes first and foremost, and really, should have a comprehensive role-based access control model, meaning that your least privileged user should be the guiding principle on how you move forward. When it comes to group policy configuration, you shouldn't really expect the same type of IT policy configuration with an OT system. And both Microsoft as well as AVEVA have provided documents on how to work with those policies with an ICS system. So things like change default passwords, disable unneeded services, block remove ports, remove unneeded software, really isolate it and secure it as much as possible. Obviously, these days, a air-gapped environment isn't typically recommended anymore, just because the management of the system becomes out of date and doesn't get managed properly, and so then security threats come elsewhere because of that lack of management. So deploy a proper patch program. AVEVA notifies users from their Security Central website, all patches and updates for both Microsoft patches as well as AVEVA patches and hotfixes. And those are all done with, in terms of a Microsoft perspective, AVEVA makes all patches compatible with the software within 15 days. But really, the goal is, I'm not going to go through each of these bullet points, but the goal is to implement, a program that's that makes sense for your organization, in terms of how you monitor and manage that patch process. Who does it? If you're documenting it, where it gets documented, so where then you can retrieve it, where it can be retrieved. And then other things obviously to consider, your typical antivirus or anti-malware software, any kind of intrusion detection system or intrusion prevention systems, really the use of an IPS isn't really recommended for control networks, and really to consider the effect of monitoring to ensure that the performance isn't negatively impacted. And then the use of software firewalls as well as firewall security appliances, and then when connecting to outbound internet sources, whitelisting the necessary websites, so to limit that access, if your system does have access to the internet. When it comes to policy monitoring and reporting, for policies, have a formal definition of rules and procedures for all the people accessing the environment. Things like including passwords, user exit, data disposal, equipment disposal, reporting, etc. And then monitoring and reporting. Considering centrally monitoring the security state of the operational technology system through system information and event management system. And then establish policies for regular reporting and auditing of the security environment. So as I mentioned, right, node-to-node security, encrypting those sweet link message exchange and iData data information with that TLS 1.2 encryption, certificate-based encryption. And so how does that work? With the configurator, you can enable that system management server, which then generates a certificate. And that certificate is a self-signed certificate, or it can be generated in a few different ways. It can be self-signed, meaning the computer that is, the local computer itself is generating that certificate. Or they can be domain issued certificates, are usually the two most common ways of implementing them. And those certificates are renewed on a regular interval basis. And so basically you go here to the management server, generate the certificate, and then it produces that certificate, which establishes that node as a part of the system. So yeah, I've mentioned kind of external security, but there's also a component to who can do what in internal security and how that works within the confines of system platform, leveraging Active Directory and your domain controller. So right, you have the authentication mode. It can be OS users or OS groups, and then going down the list of tabs, you have the ability to define security groups, which really you define operational groups that are able to manage and run certain objects. So you can group and allocate those objects however you see best fit. Maybe it's areas of the plant, or maybe it's different lines, for example. And you can then group those objects into the necessary security groups. And then those role-based permissions. So you have the general permissions at the top, which are a lot of administrative and developmental permissions. And they can be, as granular to, you can have the ability to edit an object, but you can't deploy an object, for example. And then down at the bottom, you have the similar operational permissions developed from, or that are based off of those security groups that I just mentioned. So the security operational permissions include things like, can you acknowledge or shelve an alarm? Do you have the approval for a verify write, for example? And then ultimately, whether you chose users or groups, you define those users or groups for those roles that have been chosen or defined. So for example, this administrator role has just the role for administrator. But if I wanted to compartmentalize to certain regions of my application, like East or West, I can define those roles by just simply clicking the checkbox. And lastly is credentials. And these credentials are for things that are part of your application, maybe third-party pieces of software that you've integrated that don't leverage Active Directory. So you define the credential and the username, as well as defining the password. And something that's been changed in the newest release, which is 2020 R2, which released a couple weeks ago, was that they've obfuscated the password. So the password is no longer visible from the GUI. So you can obviously define and change that password, but it's not visible within the system. And then, internal security can get down, right? All those user permissions that, operators have can be down to the object level and the attribute level, rather. And so you see these shield icons, and in every shield icon, right, maybe if you wanted to define a attribute for, writing to that value, you wanted to maybe not just give any user who has access to that object the ability to write to it, but even if they do, you want to enforce a secure write or a verified write, meaning a secured write, meaning you have to just re-enter your login credentials, or a verified write, which is a combination of a secured write, which means you have to also re-enter your credentials and have a external user enter their credentials as well. And so that can be done at any of the attributes that you see shields within the object editor. So as I mentioned, right, the Security Central website, it's available at the global customer support site, which is found at, this is an old URL, which I believe will redirect you to the right one. So you can still use this one, but also if you go to softwaresupport.aveva.com and click on the Security Central tile, it'll take you here, give you a list of all the Microsoft and application-specific security patches that have been applied, the dates, and the descriptions of those patches. So you can review on, if and when to implement those patches, as well as provide you with the policy guidelines as well. So some tech notes surrounding domain security. With updates, sometimes the accounts and security groups that come with the install of system platform change, and they can change for users that have a fresh install, or for users that have just upgraded from an older version. And because the original install was from a past and older version, those names of user groups or the service accounts that are used to do different functions might be different. So it'll document all the changes that have been made, and things to include in terms of your policies. And then in terms of managing your policies, sometimes customers already have existing policies, specifically that eliminate unrecognized accounts and groups. And this specific tech note, 10.297, goes over the details of how to work with those policies, and some suggestions to use managed service accounts or group managed service accounts within that domain controller to properly manage the system platform groups, user groups, and service accounts within that policy. So let's hop into the demo. So first, I'll just kind of show you my domain controller. And really, I don't have much configured in terms of policy, but the main thing just to know is the West supervisor, East supervisor, and the administrator users. That's what I'll be using in the actual demo. So if I go into my runtime environment, and this is kind of an all-in-one node, so it's not following best practices, but it's just a demo. So within the OMI environment, currently I'm logged in as no user, and I have the ability to view and navigate within there, but the ability to maybe acknowledge an alarm or change a value isn't possible. If I were to enter these credentials, the value wouldn't change. But before I continue on with discussing the front environment, let's just quickly take a look to what I've configured in the development environment. I go to the development environment and navigate to Galaxy and configure security. Every time you open up the configure security tool, it'll automatically synchronize with your domain controller. So whether there's change to users or policies, that'll get synced with system platform. So you can see I've chosen user-based, and really the only reason for that is as I sign into different users, you understand which user, and it's not just a user that's assigned to a mysterious group. And I've defined just generically the objects that are Eastern states into the Eastern security group, and the Western states that are grouped into the Western security group. And then I have my roles, which administrator has full administrative privileges, and the supervisor roles have just the inability to operate each other's objects. So as I mentioned during the PowerPoint, right, if you expand these out, the operational permissions, things like acknowledging or shelving or modifying alarms, and the ability to configure, operate attributes, and be that verifier for a verified right. And then ultimately for the users, defining those roles. So just something to note, right? Administrator has the admin role. The East supervisor has the East supervisor role, and the West supervisor has the West supervisor role. And notice that they all have the default user. Again, that's the lowest common denominator role. In this case, default has no permissions. But if you maybe had some sort of universal permission, you would enable here in the default user role. And then lastly, the third-party user credentials. I just gave an example of, for example, maybe, leveraging our AVEVA Insight product. If you integrated that within your application, right, that doesn't use Active Directory, that uses just an email address and a login credential. And so if you wanted to, associate that with the system platform login, this is where you would do it. Something also to note, which I forgot to mention, is from a security standpoint, all user actions, rights, our events are logged out of the box with no configuration needed. So every time you make a write, make a change within the system, acknowledge an alarm, that's all going to be captured within the historian out of the box. And really it comes from a simple principle of not really making you make the decision of what to manage in terms of logging events and things like that. We just assume you want it all, everything's important, and you can retrieve that information whenever you'd like. So if I go ahead and log into a user, unless for the sake, we'll just log into our administrator user. I have the ability to, these flow targets, right, are defined by a verified right. So if I, here, let me just put in a value. So I'll enter my domain name, my password, and then the verifier. So, right, if I were to verify, again, this is Connecticut, so it's an East state. So I need the Eastern supervisor to verify it. And here, let me cancel this. I don't know what. There you go. Okay, so I've changed the flow target to 100, and it's moving upward, and change that value. Now, if I were to try to verify this with the Western supervisor, that wouldn't be, it would be denied in terms of that user verifying it, not because he doesn't have permissions. So if I change this to 50, for example, and again, changing the domain, the administrator to password, and the domain, oops. So if we do West supervisor and email, that value won't get changed to 50. And so the reason why is the West supervisor does have those permissions, but he isn't a part of that security group that can control the Eastern objects. Now, one of the things that you can also do is, as I mentioned, right, retrieve all those events that were done. So if you go into your SQL Server Management Studio, you go to the runtime database and the database events view table. And the only thing that you have to do is, as you open it up, the query will fail automatically. And that's because you have to define a time range. And so that's all I've added at the bottom. And I can execute the script with a condition to just include the types that begin with the word user. So all the user rights and user rights that are verified rights, alarm acknowledgements would get queried here for those events. Again, I didn't really configure anything in terms of this being logged. I just had to go to it and retrieve it. Lastly, the last thing that I want to do is just show in terms of a sort of standards management is the ability to configure multiple Galaxy styles is now available in 2020 R2. So in the past, you could only do one, and you could centrally manage, how do you want a communication error, a bad communication error to display, or certain elements, maybe a background image, or how do you want active objects to be displayed. So for example, in the runtime, you see these dark gray boxes are dark gray, but if I were to change this to a different color, maybe a purple, and apply it, and it'll change in the runtime. Now, all the security and things like Galaxy styles are universal, and they're things that don't need to be deployed, like making change to an object, for example. And the other thing, I know coming up on time, one of the key differentiators between some of the other SCADA systems out there also in terms of when it comes to, user action, right, is, the security isn't managed on the graphic level. Some, offerings, including some of our other offerings, right, they manage the security by assigning a level to a specific graphic, and managing that can be difficult. Its security is defined at the destination level. So if the button can be pressed, it'll be pressed, but it'll be evaluated, is the user that's pressing that button or making that user right have the necessary permissions to do so. And if it does, it'll grant that action. And if it doesn't, it'll reject it. And that's one of the key things that differentiates System Platform from some of the other things on the market. Because with a graphic level security, you can bypass that. You can write directly to an OPC UA server, using Excel, for example, and bypass that front end security and make a user right that wasn't really defined by any kind of role or permission. So that really defines or concludes the webinar. If you have any questions, Annie, you can field them out.
Perfect. Yes, we did have a few questions come in. Our first one is, can cloud single sign-on service be integrated with System Platform security? And then they use the examples like Okta or OneLogin.
Yeah. So you can leverage the cloud single sign-on service as well as part of the System Platform security using either of those.
Wonderful. And then our other one is, can you use MSSQL regularly to query historian data?
Yeah. So right, you can historian is built off of a SQL data. It's an extension of a SQL database. So the data isn't stored in SQL, but because it's a extension and has a link to the database tables, you can run a general SQL query against the historical data. That being said, we have very easy to use tools like Historian Client to do very easy trending or querying that don't require knowledge of SQL to do that.
Well, and then our last question is, I have existing domain policies in place. Is there anything I need to be aware of before I install System Platform?
Yeah, the tech notes that I kind of went over in the beginning of the presentation, some of those things are things to consider in terms of how you implement your policies going forward and leverage those policies within System Platform. So if you have more questions, we're happy to send those tech notes or have a conversation some other time.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim, and thank you to everyone who attended. If anyone would like to review any portion of this webinar, a recording will be available on YouTube and our website, california.wonderware.com, once available, and you'll be receiving a copy of it via email. Thank you again for attending and have a great day.